For our next talk, we have Nicholas Manning from Michigan State University, and his talk will be a convergent approach to evaluating shocks, determining the 2012 US-Midwestern drought telecoupled impacts on the Cerrado of Brazil through a gridded agricultural and economic framework. That is quite the title, Nick.
It's all right there.
Right. And I think this is the advance, I hope. Okay, thank you.
Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. And it's great to see everyone. Thank you all for attending the iGuide Forum. As Deanna mentioned, my name is Nicholas Manning, and I'm here to present this research on behalf of myself, Dr. Iman Haqiqi, and Dr. Jianguo Jack Liu. So I want to begin with a quote from the Food and Agriculture Organization that says, "At no other point in history has agriculture been faced with such an array of familiar and unfamiliar risks interacting in a hyper-connected world and a precipitously changing landscape." And I really want to focus in here on the idea of a hyper-connected world, as it's sort of a theme of iGuide and of this forum. One approach to understanding connectedness is through systems research, and I want to begin with the idea of human and natural systems. So one human system might be a farmer that has to follow certain laws and participates in trade, whereas a natural system might be the crops that they produce, the gas exchange that happens, and the decomposers and nutrients, so the biotic and abiotic factors of this environment. This idea can then be extended or evolve into the idea of coupled human and natural systems, which treats these not as separate systems, so not a human or a natural system, but integrates them together into one coupled human and natural system, or CHANS. So the main idea here is that we're integrating humans as a part of nature, not as a separate system, and focusing on the reciprocal interactions between human and natural systems. Building upon this idea comes the idea of telecoupling, which is that these coupled human-natural systems are connected across distances. So for example, the soybean farmer in the Midwest might produce the soybean and then send to China to be used as animal feed. In the example of the coupled human-natural system in China, we have two components of the natural system might be the livestock that are being produced, and the human system might be the shifts in diet or the demand for that livestock. So that's sort of interacting in different countries, and they're connected through this trade. And then we can take that simple bilateral trade example and extend it to show the global soybean trade as it stands with the major exporters and importers. Generally, as areas around the world become more affluent, the demand for meat in these areas increases. With an increasing demand for meat comes an increase in soybean imports, which are the main ingredient in animal feed. So China and the European Union right now are the major importers of soybean for animal feed, and the US, especially in the Midwest region, and Brazil, especially in the Cerrado, are the major soybean producers. For example, the US Midwest produces about 80% of the soybeans in the US, and the US as a whole produces about a third of the soybeans that are produced. So we can say here that the US Midwest and the Cerrado are sort of connected through their competition in the soybean trade. And this is important, as the Cerrado is the largest soybean producing region in Brazil, and it's also an ecoregion that is considered the world's most biodiverse tropical savanna, and only 8% of the Cerrado is federally protected, which puts at risk tons of habitat for important species and lots of ecosystem services for the area. And the Cerrado is already being rapidly converted from native cover to anthropic land uses. So it's said that 50% of the Cerrado is already converted, with another third of the Cerrado projected to be converted by 2050. So zooming back out, our research centers around the top importer, China, and the top exporters, Brazil and the US. These countries are then telecoupled through their soybean trade. Yet, as disasters are happening with more frequency and severity, drought in one area or disasters in one area, such as the Midwest, could impact production, which then may prompt competitors to produce more. And traditional disaster studies typically focus on either the shocks in one country, or they zoom out to a global study, which sort of misses this connection and how these impacts may propagate. So here we hypothesize some important cascading effects and cascading interactions where drought in one area might decrease soybean production and soybean exports, and then increase global market price and land conversion for more soybean production, with important implications for biodiversity. To address this hypothesis, we're focusing and framing our study around one major drought period, which is the 2012 drought, one of the worst in the last 100 years in the US. This drought caused over $40 billion in damages, and in July of 2012, the peak of the drought, over 88% of soybean fields were impacted by this drought. And as previously mentioned, over the past decades, the Cerrado, the world's most biodiverse tropical savanna, has been experiencing soybean expansion. We can see here in the western region and in the northeastern region especially, the change from sort of different land cover types into soybean. And you can see here on this time series of area over time that before 2012, soybean area was increasing mostly at the expense of forests. And then after 2012, this sort of shifted. You can see that after that US Midwest drought line, the pace of soybean growth sort of increased. And this kind of came at the expense of other crops and forest formation. It's a complicated picture. And so to disentangle these complex interactions, we'll probably need some sort of modeling and simulation, as it's not a straightforward one land cover use type goes into another. To test the impact of a shock on one region on production in another, we used Simple G, which is the Simplified International Model of Prices, Land Use, and the Environment, the gridded version. This is a multi-scale framework which allows for interdisciplinary integration to generate novel geospatial insights. And it allows us to have some important inputs, change some factors with these inputs, which then changes many of the equations within the model, and then we can select some of the results and compare them to the pre-simulation to get our final results. For our case, we reduced crop production across each grid cell in the US Midwest by 40%, then selected 4 response variables to show the results. We selected cropland area percent change, crop quantity index for production, which is essentially a proxy for production that takes into account the weight of the crops being produced, and then the percent change in this production index. And using Simple G it provides us with multi-scale solutions. So we get solutions at the local, sub-regional, regional, and global level. And we get this through a system of simultaneous equations where all of the grid cells are connected. So changes in one will be represented by changes in another. They're all sort of reacting with one another. From the 40% simulated shock on the US, we quantified the spatial extent of change in cropland area and in change in crop production index. So what we're trying to do here is essentially quantify the extent of telecoupling using Simple G. And we see changes across the Cerrado with large areas of change in the Mato Piba area, which is in the northeast, and in Mato Grosso area, which is on the western side. With Simple G, we were also able to quantify the steps in our chain of cascading interactions. So overall, we saw that a 40% shock led to a decrease in 16 million hectares in US cropland and an increase of around 1 million hectares of Cerrado cropland. So through this study, we showed that we can use the telecoupling framework to sort of conceptualize a problem and list some of the cascading effects and interactions that are possible, and then use Simple G to implement some controlled shock to our region of interest, get the local response to a shock, the global response to the shock, and then zoom into a local competing region to see the impacts on a specific region. So we are not only listing potential cascading interactions, but going in and using this model to then sort of quantify these as well. This is the first study that sort of framed a problem using the telecoupling framework and then assessed the quantitative impacts through Simple G. So it's mostly a proof of concept, which is why we used a 40% reduction. That's a more extreme value than the US Midwest 2012 drought actually produced in terms of impact to soybean and corn. So yeah, we just chose that number to sort of see the extreme side of things. Can we even use a shock to represent this connection? And also, as it stands now, the land cover land use in Brazil that we used for the inputs for Simple G wasn't necessarily representative of the time period before the drought. It's the default land use land cover within the model. So for future work, we would like to change these shocks to represent more realistic yield changes from corn and soybean, both numerically and spatially. So you can see the changes from 2011 to 2012 in soybean yield and corn yield on the top left there. We would also like to use a more temporally specific land cover maps for Brazil and the Cerrado in the pre-drought area. And we plan on doing this by using the spatial production and allocation model, which gives us 2012 yield maps at 5 arc minute resolution, which is nice because that's the same resolution as simple G, so they can be connected pretty easily. And we also plan to quantify impacts to biodiversity. So right now we looked at cropland area change and crop production index, but this doesn't say anything about biodiversity, which is spatially heterogeneous across the Cerrado. So changes in one area might not be as significant to changes in another, and we'll need to look into the actual impacts to biodiversity on this front. Also, we can extend this to not just be telecoupling, but we can look at the metacoupled impacts as well from as Jack's talk earlier highlighted. We can look at the impacts not just between these two areas, but some of the cascading interactions within each of these systems and between adjacent systems. So in summary, the US, Brazil, and China are telecoupled through soybean trade. Disasters in one area may impact production and cropland expansion in another. We use Simple G to simulate a 40% shock across the US Midwest, and the Cerrado responds to this shock to sort of have a proof of concept idea of how can we quantify the extent of telecoupling using Simple G. Overall, the shock led to a decrease in US production, cropland area, and exports, and an increase in Cerrado cropland area in Mato Grosso and Mato Piba. I'm very thankful for my collaborators on this project. Without it, it would not have been possible, and these associated organizations, and for all of you for listening.